Rights Commission for a very important presentation by Professor Henry Brodaty. Before I introduce Henry to you, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora tribe and express my respect for their elders past and present. Well, as you all know, I think some of you are regular attenders to our Rights Talks, and today's presentation is one in a series of talks by experts, outstanding people whose work contributes in one way or another to the advancement of human rights of all of us. And we make these talks available to the general public and those who have particular interest, because we do believe that human rights are for everyone, everywhere, every day. But I'm particularly excited as Age Discrimination Commissioner to have the benefit of sitting and hearing a presentation from you, Henry. Professor Henry Brodaty, he has so many reasons why you're going to love listening to what he has to say, but he does head Australia's premier brain research institute at the University of New South Wales. It's called the Centre for Healthy Brain Aging. We like that very much. And he, with his colleague there, is undertaking immensely important research into what happens to the aging brain, particularly what happens to the aging brain when problems like dementia arise. But Henry is also very committed to the improvement of older people in the community, people who may be suffering from dementia. He was one of the founders of Alzheimer's Australia and is still a very strong supporter of the wonderful work that Alzheimer's Australians do. He has many international collaborations in the area, and I just think at this crucial time when we're trying to come to terms with the hugely changed demographics, the great ageing of our population, the positives that that implies, but also the need to pay more attention and be able to be more supportive to people who do get some illnesses associated with ageing, such as dementia. I think we were very, very lucky to have here in Australia, indeed here in Sydney, the Centre for Healthy Brain Ageing, and particularly to have someone of your expertise, experience and commitment to help us look for and no doubt one of these days find the big breakthroughs in this matter. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd ask you to welcome Professor Henry Brodaty.
Thanks very much, Susan, and it's a pleasure to be here. And particularly thanks to Susan for inviting me. Susan and I were on the Aged Care Reform Implementation Council before the change of government last year. And so we got to know each other there, and very important work to do with trying to improve the care of older people in Australia. And it's an area I've been committed to now for, well, I guess 25 years or longer. Well, 30 years. I'm getting old myself. So I'm growing old in Australia, and I'm particularly interested in human rights, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So let me just give you some background about some of the issues as I was thinking about this. Are you going the wrong way? Here we go. So Simone de Beauvoir wrote her book Old Age, and in it she says society is not only guilty but downright criminal. It treats the old as outcasts. A different view was put by Betty Friedan in her book The Fountain of Age, saying aging is not lost youth. It's a new stage of opportunity and strength. And here are some headlines that I've culled over the last few years. So this was Wayne Swan in 1910 releasing the third intergenerational report on aging. And this is one of the issues that will keep coming up. This intergenerational competition for resources. Should older people give up resources, be it jobs or be it healthcare, for younger generations? This is from The Guardian in the UK. 60 people a week dying alone at home. And every few months we'll see a new headline of somebody who had died alone at home and had been dead for a year or 2 years before somebody found them. What a tragedy that is. And every few months there's another headline about the nursing home scandal. This is from the Sydney Morning Herald. A rise in frail nursing home patients going hungry and thirsty has forced increased surveillance of the industry. This was when Justine Elliott was Minister for Ageing. I hope things will improve. On Friday last, we saw the scandal about Macquarie Bank, the Bank of Millionaires, the Wealth Club, where a lot of financial advice had been given by fairly junior people and people who've lost a lot of money, particularly older people. Millions, well, many millions, maybe hundreds of millions, I'm not sure. But this has been in the news in the last week. Again, the right of older people to maintain their finances and get good advice. Another one in the drum, pretty recently, July 2014, Retirement Village Rorts, the booming scandal. And again, older people are vulnerable. And one of the things I'll be talking about is the rights of older people for protection against it. This is a case I've talked about in other venues. Graham Wiley was a Qantas pilot who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He had a girlfriend of his own age who went with her friend to Mexico, and they got some Nembutal, brought it back to him. He took it and died. And this is the contentious issue of the right to death, not just the right for life. She was charged with murder, but she had cancer herself and had stashed some of her own Nembutal, and she died before the court case. One of the big issues is work and ageing. I know it's an issue very close to Susan's heart, and so I think that's well exemplified in the conundrum shown here. So let's do a little experiment about ageing, and I'm sure this audience doesn't have ageist attitudes, but many people do. Think of a breakdancer. Well, you wouldn't think of her. Think of a university graduate. And you wouldn't think of this lady who at 94, having had only a primary school education, had gone back to university and was the oldest master's graduate in the world here in Australia. And Dorothy below, actually at 100, she played in the Masters Games in Mongolia. And she came and talked to one of our forums at South Sydney Juniors on about 2 or 3 years ago. And she died last year at the age of 102. So ageism is where people are discriminated against because of their age, particularly old age. So let me turn to the topic for the day. What are our rights? What do we expect in old age? The thing we all have in common, day by day, is that we're growing older. And many more of us are reaching old age. I've reached it officially. And that's going to increase disproportionately, as I'll show you. So what I'll talk about is just some basic facts about the demographics. And then I'll use the human rights principles enunciated by the United Nations as the framework for talking about some of these rights, pointing out some of the conundrums for society and some of the things we can do in the future to address these. So in Australia, we have currently about 23.5 million people. And that's expected to reach 35.5 million people approximately by 2050. But if you look at the graph on the right, the histogram, you'll see that the 0 to 14-year-olds, they're dropping. So this is 14, 2030, 2050. You see, proportion of the population, they're dropping. The 15 to 49-year-olds, dropping even more. The 50 to 60-year-olds, 64-year-olds, stable. 65-year-olds increasing, 75 to 84 increasing, and the 85 plus increasing even more. So it's an aging society. For every older person now, there are 2 children. By that 2050, there'll be 2 older people for every child. Just looking at the 75-year-olds plus, there'll be an extra 4 million between 2012 and 2060. We'll go from 6.4% of the population being 75 or over to 14.5% of the population being 75 or over. It's going to be a different world when our kids and grandkids get to old age. And the reason is because people are living longer. We're having fewer babies and people are living longer. So here's an example. In June 1981, of every 1,000 men aged 80, 100 would be dead in the next 12 months. 30 years later, in 2011, of every 1,000 men, 56 would be dead in the next 12 months. So the death rate dropped from 10% to 5.6%. The numbers for women are equally dramatic. 65 out of 1,000 will die in the next 12 months to 36 in that 30-year period. A 65-year-old man today can expect to live another 18 years, say to 83, on the average. A woman to 87. Centenarians, I think, bring this into very sharp focus. Currently, there are over 6,000 centenarians in Australia. By 2030, not so far away, there'll be almost 19,000 centenarians. A lot of telegrams. Now, ageing has implications for costs. If you look at the costs in Australian budget, the big ends are the beginning and the ends of life. And the beginning, the major driver of cost is education. Whereas in the late life, it's health, age pension, and age care. And you'll see the amounts are much greater in late life. So, ageing and new technologies are putting pressure on Australian budgets. It's estimated that the GDP, the government spending, will have risen by almost 6 percentage points of GDP, which is huge. And the areas most affected by ageing are health, pensions, and aged care, i.e. nursing homes. So this is going to be a big challenge for governments to meet. I was surprised to find that about 80% of older people are on the pension or eligible. And the figures are pretty constant from 2007 through to 2047. You see the bottom line, the blue line, is 20% are not on any pension. The top line, I think it's a blue, I'm not sure, are the full-time pensioners, and the green line going up are the part-time pensioners. And what is happening is a reversal. There'll be more part-time pensioners than full-time pensioners, whereas currently there are more full-time than part-time, but still 80% of older people. So will superannuation take care of this? The answer is probably not. It'll only change about 6%. That's the estimates from, I think it was Productivity Commission, that will change in the people on pension. Now, it's often thought this is going to be a tragedy for gross domestic product. But we need to think about what GDP measures. And GDP measures actually discriminates against older people. It excludes things like leisure, volunteering, household provided caring services. Population ageing increases production of these very goods, but reduces GDP growth. So if we look at GDP as our metric for economic health, ageing will be detrimental should the GDP be redefined. The Productivity Commission says this should be borne in mind when interpreting future slowdown in GDP growth. The common stereotype is older people are decrepit, they're not functional, they're a drain on our society, they go into nursing homes, but the facts are actually quite different. Let me illustrate. The overwhelming majority of older people live in private dwellings in the community. Only 6% live in non-private dwellings, including aged care homes and hospitals. Even amongst those aged over 85, 3/4 live in private dwellings. What about employment? Well, let's break it down by 5-year blocks. You look at men aged 65 to 69, and there's a bar on your left. About a third of men in that age group are still working. And each 5 years, it drops by about half. So between 70 and 74, about a sixth. Between 75 and 79, about a 12th. roughly the proportions of women still in paid employment, not working, paid employment, I should say, are dropping by about half as well. They're about half as what the men are. So, whereas it's over 30% for men in the 65 to 69 age group, it's under 20%, or about 18% for women. So it's approximately half the rate for men at each quinquennium. Older Australians are working still in paid employment. Older Australians are also active contributors. Almost half of 65 to 74-year-olds provide unpaid assistance to someone outside their house. A third are volunteering through organisations. Almost a third are involved in community organisations. 2/3 are in social or support groups. A quarter, despite having low incomes relatively, are actually financially supporting somebody outside their house, usually the child or another relative. So older people are contributing big time to our society. So let me now turn to the main topic, which is human rights for older people. So I thought, well, I'd go through some of the documents on human rights, and there are so many on human rights for older people, and it's pretty boring reading out list after list of all the rights that have been enumerated by others. But here are some of the documents that I looked at, and it's the second one, the UN Principles for Older Persons, which will be the framework that I'll talk about. The Australian Human Rights Commission has also put out a document called Human Rights Approach to Ageing and Health, Respect and Choice. And it has a number of principles: non-discrimination, equality, available services, accessible and appropriate or good quality, that all makes sense. Progressive realisation, which I read as a gradual approach to get there. Participation and accountability. And to do that, you need to monitor what's going on. So, particularly in aged care reform, the commission that Susan and I sat on, some of the things that are coming in or have come in are consumer-directed care. There's a big emphasis on advanced care planning, supported decision making, health literacy. Empowering people to make decisions means they have to know what the decisions are about and what the consequences and alternatives are. Acceptability, particularly for special groups, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, veterans, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, intersexual communities, women, people living in rural and remote areas. And the other points of quality of access, quality of services, access, and accountability. So let me now turn to the 14 principles that have been articulated by the United Nations. And I'll give you examples, I'll give you some of the problems, and where I can, some of the experiences I've had and some of the possibilities that we have. So the first one is older people or persons should have access to adequate food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, through the provision of income, family, and community support and self-help. And this was, I found on Google, is doctors, this is a lady in Africa, doctors say I'm wasting their time, they don't want to treat me because I'm old. Could this happen to Australia? You betcha, and I'll give you some examples. Okay. Adequacy of income in Australia. Well, is the pension adequate to live on? Well, it is, because people are living, but it's very tough. Will the provisions for future be enough? Is the indexation fair? Well, that's a debate. Adequacy of support in Australia really depends on the attitudes. The attitudes of families. We don't have multi-generational families in Australia, as they do in many cultures. It depends on the culture people live in, but the general attitudes of the public. And the general attitudes of the public and of the medical profession itself are often ageist. So the second thing is older people and work. That's the second principle from the United Nations. And what they say is older paid persons, and I've got Susan's photo here, because at ACRIC, she was always putting up the view, you know, we should give opportunities when staffing was being put for the aged care website. Let's have older people manning, womaning that staffing, that the telephone line to help people. So older persons should have opportunities to work, have access to other income-generating opportunities, and should be able to participate, determining when and what pace to withdraw from the labour force. Oops. Now, here's something I'd like to go through in some detail. The changes in productivity growth have huge impacts on output growth. The Productivity Commission looked at the base value of productivity, looked at the cumulative sum of annual GDP between 2012 and almost 2060. And you add up all those years, it's about $140 trillion held constant for 2012 dollars. If we just increase labour productivity by 0.3%, it would increase the cumulative value by $13 trillion, which is equivalent to 8 years of Australia's GDP. In other words, if we can get near 0.3% more people working and producing, what an impact it would have. And of course, there are lots of communities who are excluded from work, and older people being the one that I'm particularly passionate about. So encouraging employers to attract older people is a challenge. Older people should have access to appropriate educational and training programs. And we do, I think, pretty well in Australia. There's quite a lot happening. There's the University of the Third Age. In my neck of the woods, there's the Coast Centre for Seniors at Little Bay on the old Prince Henry side. And the bottom photograph of the older women doing belly dancing is at the Coast Centre for Seniors. There's a group of tap dancers there as well. We have them come along to our forums and every few years and do a demonstration. There are people learning Italian and doing computers. There's a lot happening. Are you a tap dancer? Okay. Older persons should be able to live in environments that are safe and adaptable to personal preferences and changing capacities. One of the change moments for Australia was the International Year of the Disabled. And from there, we started getting changes to the building codes, to the toilet codes. We started making places accessible for people with disabilities, which had a large overlap for older people as well. And there are things like buses that kneel. There's a public toilet map, which is a great website if you need to go frequently and need to find out how to plan your route. And there are toilets which are accessible as well. In my field, I work a lot with dementia. Quite often, the person with dementia needs to go to a toilet with their spouse to help them with the toileting. But it's very hard for any male and female toilets available. So there's work to be done here, but there's been quite a lot of progress. Older persons should be able to reside for as long as possible in their own homes. That was the 6th principle from the United Nations. And again, I think we've done major strides in Australia. If you look back over the last 20 years, community services have improved vastly. There's quite a lot of positive developments. There's the Home and Community Care Program. There are now 4 levels of community packages, with some of them associated with dementia supplements. Consumer-directed care was introduced last year for all new packages, and from July next year will be mandatory for all community aged care packages. And each, used to be called each packages. So that's been a big change and led by the consumer movement, led by older people, people with dementia, Alzheimer's, Australia. However, there have been limitations. The quality of services is variable. There is not the same standard of monitoring of quality as there is for residential care. The needs, there are a lot of unmet needs in the community. They're not always available. It's particularly a problem in rural areas where there may be a single provider, there's no competition. They're not always accessible, particularly if you're from a special group. So it may be dietary requirements for the cultural group the person's from, and the waiting times can be quite long. So it can be 2 or 3 months to get an aged care assessment team to come and do the assessment and approve somebody, which is the gatekeeper for all the services. And then it can be several months to get the service. The 7th principle. Older people remain integrated in society, participate actively in the formulation and implementation of policies that directly affect their well-being and share their knowledge and skills with younger generations. And the 2 photographs here, the first one, the top one's a family member helping his granddaughter. The bottom one is a school I visited in Cleveland, and it's an intergenerational school where Peter Whitehouse and his wife have got real teaching program with a certified and approved curriculum, but have people from all generations teaching each other. And there are very few of these in the world, whether that's the way to go. But certainly bringing generations together, not competition between generations, but collaboration between them. And we see this in nursing homes. There's a number of nursing homes where people bring in, mothers bring in their babies, and the babies interact with the people in the nursing home. Another nursing home where the residents who are a bit higher functioning usually go into a preschool and work with the kids. There is quite a lot of scope for more intergenerational collaboration. Older people should be able to seek and develop opportunities for service to the community and to serve as volunteers. And I've got the Volunteering Australia logo there. And as I said before, older people are really the backbone of volunteer services in Australia. About a third of volunteers are older people. Older people should be able to form movements or associations of older persons. So, Council on the Ageing, Australian Seniors, Co-Centre for Seniors, there are a number of associations. See, right now, I think it's about 40% of the electorate is over 50. Within a generation, it will be over half the electorate will be over 50. So, we older people have got power. We just need to coalesce it and exercise the power to make these changes that will benefit older people. And I think politicians are becoming more and more aware of the older people, because older people not only are increasing in number, they usually all vote. Whereas my kids didn't start voting until they were about 30 or something. They were voting. Yeah. Older people should benefit, number 10, older people should benefit from family and community care and protection in accordance with each society's system of cultural values. Now, this is an area that I've become involved in a number of ways. I sat on the guardianship tribunal for a while. I see patients who've suffered because of this lack of protection. And there's some slides coming out. Healthcare. Older persons should have access to healthcare to help them to maintain or retain the optimal level of physical, mental, and emotional well-being, and to prevent or delay the onset of illness. Again, this is an area that I'm particularly involved in. So here are some studies we were involved in. We found, we looked at a study many years ago looking at how well GPs diagnose mental illness. And they were particularly bad at diagnosing it if the person was older. Because the prevailing view may be that if a person, say, 80-something and depressed, what do you expect? Not only were they not getting diagnosed, if they were diagnosed, they were much less likely to be referred for specialist treatment. So my colleagues, Brian Draper and Anita Scherer, analysed Medicare data. And Medicare data is very good because it tells you by item number what services are being delivered. And so psychiatrists have particular item numbers, each rated by time. So up to 15 minutes is one item number, 15 to 30 another one, and so on. So what was found, that proportionate to population, older people were getting 1/3 of the psychiatric consultations to middle-aged adults. And the consultations they were getting were the briefer ones. They weren't getting the talking therapies. We can induce that they were probably getting drug treatments, but not other sorts of therapy in those sessions. Brian Draper and Shirley Footeran looked at a survey of older people with mental health problems in our area health service and looking at their needs. And they found that their mental and physical health needs were pretty well met. But the unmet needs were social, daily activities, company, existence of a confidant. The commonest complaint I see when I see people clinically is of being lonely, of having a lack of stimulation, a lack of company. Often widowed, isolated because of difficulty with transport and mobility, and isolation is a huge problem. Now, the cost of health is increasing faster than the growth in the economy. Spending on health in our last year of life is said to be more than we spend on the rest of our life years accumulated, particularly in the last month of life. So we should stop spending, I guess, a year before we're going to die, and that would save the health budget quite a lot. We don't know when we're going to die, is the problem. And we're often faced with this dichotomy, well, should we be spending these resources in our last year of life for older people, where we should be spending on young people who've got their whole future ahead of them? And the counter-argument, well, old people have provided taxes, have paid for this over a lifetime of work, why should they be denied? And I think it's a false dichotomy. We should be doing both, of course. So we need to make our health system more efficient. In 2012-13, I was on the McKeon Review of Health and Medical Research Australia, which may be the basis for this future fund for medical research, I hope so. And we delivered our report in February last year to the Minister of the Health, who was Clipper Secretary at the time. And what we found in our review was that a third of health dollars could be saved by eliminating waste. Waste could be in practices, it could be in unnecessary investigations, unnecessary treatment. And these are well-documented figures, mainly from the US. Social and legal. Older people should have access to social and legal services to enhance their autonomy, protection, and care. So this was the area that I was going to talk on earlier, elder abuse. It's estimated up to 5%, depending how it's defined, of older people are prone to be abused. And abuse can be physical, sexual, psychological, financial, by neglect, by abandonment, and even medical. Some of the physical abuse, you can see patients who have welts, lacerations, fractures, burns, excessive use of drugs, bruises, or a lack of these things, the basic things, clothes, heat, medication, food, water. And you saw that earlier headline in the nursing homes about people there going hungry. And I think we see it in hospitals. If you're an older person with dementia, you can't fill in the menu card that the dietary aid brings around. You've got a fractured arm in a sling, and they bring you a packet of cornflakes for breakfast. You ever tried to open one of those packets with one hand? It's just impossible. I see this all the time. Psychological abuse can be threats, insults, harassment. It's harder to see and can be more scarring, and certainly it's present. Oops. And then the exploitation financially. This was a US thing. $15 billion each year from telemarketing crimes, to the elderly being particularly prone. And then neglect. Withholding appropriate attention, not meeting older people's needs, failure to provide the basics, failure to help with ADLs, that's activities of daily living, or assist with personal hygiene. I've often gone to a nursing home and seen a patient, a resident there, lying in a pool of urine, having been there for some time. It's improving, and the nurses have worked very hard. It's just very difficult. And medical abuse may be withholding or excessive treatment. So there's a website there that I found where this was a woman who was secretly filmed having to call for the toilet for hours, and she was quite with it. She was just unable to move, and she was urinating in her bed because she couldn't get anybody to come and help her. And of course, it's Eve, and she was what, 98-year-old Yvonne Brad begging for help. What about the use of restraints? Now, this is something that we shouldn't use at all. But sometimes it may be necessary to try and stop a person falling and breaking a limb. I'm thinking of a patient who had a stroke, which left him paralysed down one side, but also with anosognosia. So he didn't recognise that he was paralysed. And so he would try and get up. Every time he got up, of course, he fell over. And that meant that he was at risk of fracturing a limb. Is restraint not permissible in that? And then how do you restrain them? Clearly, the manacles in the top left-hand photo is unacceptable. And also this posy restraint around the chair is not a very good solution. And use of pills as a restraint increases the risk of falls. So this is a contentious area. As a principle, we say no restraints. However, there are some difficult areas in that terrain. So we have the competing rights. We talk about human rights. Whose rights? And which rights take precedence? My right to be looked after, be protected, even if I don't realise it, or my right to make my choice. So this is a picture that was in the Sydney Morning Herald in March this year. And the Brodaty have been in the local papers and in the mainstream papers for some years. And the older lady is a hoarder. And she hoards and hoards. And accompanying that photo was a photo of the older lady with her daughter sleeping in a hired van outside their house because there was no more room in the house because everything was hoarded. The neighbours are up in arms because of the risk of vermin. It's a health risk as well as looking unsightly. And so is it her right to do what she wants in the home? Or is it a public good to override that right and take away and clean up the place against her will, which has been done several times, but only to be reaccumulated. So these are some of the competing rights: autonomy versus beneficence. Our right to be looked after and be protected, our right to make decisions. Is it a right to hoard? Is it a right to die? Here's Thomas Keneally arguing for euthanasia and saying there should be tribunals, and the Qantas pilot I mentioned earlier. Our right to make bad decisions. This is a famous case. John Howard Marshall married Anne Nicole Smith. John Howard Marshall was in his 80s, Anne Nicole Smith was in her 20s, and a former Playmate of the Year. So it was fun looking her up on Google because she's got some very attractive photographs. They married, and 1 year later he had died. Thereafter followed a whole lot of court cases from his children from earlier marriages about who has the rights for the estate. Eventually Anne Nicole died of a drug overdose, and having married subsequently as well, and so it was a double tragedy. Carmel, Peter and I had some patience, and we thought we'd write a paper on what's the capacity to marry. What do you need? You know, about testamentary capacity, but what about capacity to marry? Actually, the threshold's pretty low. All you have to know is you're going to live together as a man and a woman. In the current legislation, anyway. So it's very low. So he had the right to make bad decisions. Does he also have the right to be protected from it? The hardest thing I have to deal with is driving.
Me too.
People say I have the right to drive, but the public has the right to be protected from bad drivers as well, not all old, of course. But I see people with dementia, and it's clear when somebody has severe dementia, they should not be driving. When someone has mild dementia, maybe they can drive safely. Where they cross that line is contentious. And for men in particular, where a car is almost a penile attachment, they don't want to lose their capacity to drive. Older people have to be tested at the age of 85 in New South Wales. I'm told that the arguments or the evidence that this is actually working is pretty slim. So here again is a human right versus a conundrum between the rights of the older person versus the safety of the community. 13th, almost finished. The 13th one was about people having institutional care providing protection, rehab, social and mental stimulation in a humane and secure environment. And here you see in the top left picture, a party happening around some people in residential care. The bottom left-hand picture is this from the Central Coast nursing home, where they bring in the children and their mothers to actually spend time with the residents there. The mothers have a bit of a break, the older people get very stimulated, and you see them come to life. And the bottom right-hand picture is a study we did called the SMILE study, which was a study of humour therapy in nursing homes, where we engaged people we worked with humour therapists who engaged people in older people with songs, with playing games with them, by getting them to recount anecdotes, and we showed it reduced agitation, improved depression, and improved quality of life. One of the other rights, and again it's something I see commonly, is older people I see in nursing homes say, I don't want to be here, I want to go. And no one's tying them down. They don't have the capacity to leave the nursing home. No one has the capacity to look after them. And so the dilemma for us is protecting them, the duty of care versus the right to have your freedom. So human rights are not always black and white. The final one is dignity. older people should be able to enjoy their human rights and fundamental freedoms when residing in any sheltered care or treatment facility, including full respect of their dignities, beliefs, needs and privacy, and the right to make their decisions about care and the quality of their lives. Well, dignity is not always in great abundance. In hospitals, for example, now I know why they call it ICU. You know, you see older people walking around just like this, but sometimes there are empathic healthcare staff who are able to help them with their dignity. So I think you'll find I'm one of the most empathic doctors around. So I like it. One of the other issues in nursing homes is intimacy. So it may be that two people who are not married form a bond and want to be intimate with each other, and they even want to get married. Or maybe two people of the same sex who form a bond. Many institutional homes have different ethical principles which make it difficult for them to accept this, particularly when couples, when they're not couples prior to them coming into the home, or one of them still married to somebody outside the home. So again, a competing right. The right to have your freedom to make choices. People in the community make choices about having relationships outside their marriages. Should people in nursing homes be denied that choice? So let me finish up here. Older people have the same rights as everyone, as anyone. What's your motto? Everyone, anywhere, everywhere, every day. Yes, okay. And that's true. But there are gaps specific to older people, particularly where they're vulnerable, where they've lost capacity, where they're physically less mobile. There are gaps in care, in lifestyle, in protection. There's the issue I hope I've highlighted of competing rights between protection versus autonomy, the person's rights and society's rights. And this intergenerational competition for resources is a false dichotomy. We need cross-generational resources to advance really the welfare of all of us. So thank you there, Susan. Thanks for the invitation. The talk will be hosted on our website, the top one, Centre for Healthy Brain Aging, or chiba.unsw.edu.au. Thank you very much.
Well, well, that was almost overwhelming in the amount of information and the importance of the analysis of that information that was presented to us. And I suppose for me, having also thought about these things for a while, Henry, the competing rights question is an issue we're all challenged by, and also the intergenerational issue is something I'm grappling with. But look, I'm sure people here have questions and comments, and so I'll join Henry here and I'll invite you to ask or comment on that brilliant presentation. So, yes, in the front seat.
I recently returned to Australia from living in the United States for nearly 20 years, and I was really struck by the degree of ageism, especially combined with sexism, and especially in relation to
people back here.
No, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
I'm just saying I returned to Australia after living in the United States for 20 years, and I was really struck by the degree of ageism and sexism in relation to ageism in this country, and the loss of expertise and knowledge in people over 60 being out of work and unable to get work. And that set me thinking about how we talk about old age, and we started about talking about employment and ended up with people who are decrepit or extremely old. And I started to think about we needing a language to talk about this, because we have one word called old or aging. And I thought, well, perhaps we could have early maturity in the 60s, and maturity in the 70s, and early aging in the 80s, and aged 90 and over. No, this is just a loose thing. Language defines so much of how we behave. And if we thought of our 60-year-olds and our 70-year-olds who are still going really strong, and I have a friend in the United States who's 100, who's just sent me his 6th paper that he's written for the year, saying, you might like to look at this. Then perhaps we actually have some tools to engage with improvement.
Yeah, I agree language is very important. And we're always struggling with this. So we talk about the elderly, people don't like that. First of all, it assumes that everyone over 65 is homogenous. When we know that the lifespan is not 25 or 30 years, we don't assume everyone from 0 to 25 is the same as well. Elderly doesn't work, old people doesn't work. And so older people is what's generally accepted because we're all older, older than we were or whatever. But I don't know the answer to that. Particularly in psychiatry, we have the same problem. I was professor of psychogeriatrics. My patient said, I don't want to be psycho, and I don't want to be geriatric. So I'm now professor of aging and mental health, because I'm trying to, I think language is important.
Yes, thanks. Look, I think language is important too, and people do express their views to you when you're describing a situation with the best of intentions, and they don't agree with your description. But I have to say, Henry and I guess, I'm on a little bit of a campaign about reclaiming the word old. I don't think there's anything wrong with the word old. I am old. Many people here are old. You, if you're lucky, will all get old. And in fact, yesterday we launched a video aimed at discrimination, age discrimination in the workforce, called The Power of Oldness. And most people like it. Some people say, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. So I think the word old is a fine word, but older is more accurate because, as you say, we're all older than we were yesterday, and a 2-day-old child is older than the baby was the day before. But it is an important issue, and we have to, I think, discriminate between people using language in a way that you think could be improved and people who are deliberately trying to put older people down. That's where I draw the line. Up to that, yes, please. Someone will bring you the microphone so we can all hear the question.
Well, you mentioned, thank you for your talk. You mentioned that there's a problem of underemploying. And some of the things that I've actually seen in the research is actually that there's a big problem with people actually being misdiagnosed as having psychiatric problems due to, for example, nutritional deficiencies or other things, particularly endocrine problems, and then they're given psychiatric medications that are actually contraindicated for what's actually going on with them. So I'm just wondering, sort of as a psychiatrist, my background is psychology, but I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, because I think it does go both ways there.
There's no doubt that nutritional deficiencies or endocrine abnormalities can cause psychiatric problems such as depression or mania or cognitive impairment. So what we teach medical students is when an older person presents with a new problem, and then a psychiatric problem, you should always look for a physical cause before you start doing the other treatment. And if that's not always followed, that's not good medical practice. I don't know how common it is, because it's so easy for a doctor to order a whole bunch of blood tests, even easier than doing a physical examination.
Anyone else with a question? Oh, yes. Can you bring the one?
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for that presentation. My name is Kelly Vincent, and I represent the Dignity Disability Party in the Parliament of South Australia. And so, one of the points in particular that you raised was of interest to me, and that is the universality of, when we meet the needs of people with disabilities, for example, or meeting a lot of the needs of older Australians. But I'm wondering, how successful is that argument? How successful do you find people responding to that argument in your work?
I don't know the answer to your question. What I was thinking about, for example, having ramps, so people with wheeling trains can go up the ramp, or in wheelchairs can go up the ramps as well. And so older people are more likely to have those walking aids. And that's what I meant for the overlap of disability. I'm no expert in disability field, so I can't comment. Susan might more comment.
Well, I'm supposed to be very knowledgeable about the overlap since I've recently been made the Commissioner for Disability Discrimination as well as age discrimination. But as I tried to say to the Attorney General who made this decision, they're not the same things. They're definitely not the same thing. Some people are born with a disability or acquire a disability early in life, and they are entitled to and need support so that they can live their lives as fully as possible. Whereas, although we're all heading to old age, and most of us make it these days, it's not a situation which for most of our lives should attract particular attention. But things like universal design, where we would like all buildings and all facilities to be designed so that everybody can access them, I think that's where there's important overlap. And I think it would be a great reform for our whole society if universal design, opening doors, ramps, lifts where you can actually read the lift buttons rather than having the numbers somehow invisibly. You know, and you could all think of other examples, the way typical houses or apartments are built, where are the cupboards? Can most people reach them, let alone a person with a disability or an older person who's got a bit of arthritis? These are the sorts of changes which I think do overlap, and they are universal. And architects and designers and so on are aware of them, but it is a long way away from happening in all of our community, homes, offices. So I think, you know, on those areas that we have where we can see benefits to all of us, we pursue together, but we should never think that, oh, it's all the same, and so we don't need special consideration, research, treatment, and so forth. Up the back there. Oh, sorry, did I miss you? You'll be sorry. You're warming up.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I just couldn't help but notice that, especially in media and advertising, old people are not seen as epitomes of wisdom anymore, or not anymore, such as in other societies. And I think that that's quite unfortunate and saddening. And I was wondering if Australia has a future where that could change, possibly, and if so, how do you think we would come about that? Maybe is it when the aging population is not the larger percent, and so they're not seen as such a burden anymore? Part of it is great. But I was just wondering if you thought that that would ever be a possibility where they would be seen as knowledgeable and wise and trustworthy again.
Gosh, I hope so. You're right, advertisements always have people who are very athletic or beautiful and usually younger, and we know that younger people spend disproportionately more than older people, but older people, like their numbers, are going to be a bigger market. So it makes sense for advertisers to actually reach out to them. I don't know if the economic forces will achieve that. Movies as well. You know, I actually get tired of seeing coming of age movies. You know, when people go 17 to 18 or whatever, trials of death. And so if you look at movies that are targeted for older people, or the stars of the movies are older, and they certainly attract a lot of the audience. The Marigold Hotel one, that really was a great hit. So there are some things happening. But you're right, we don't have that tradition in our society that older people have wisdom. And older people are past the use-by date. It's more the common. That's the ageism that we're talking about. Have you got some solutions?
I don't know if they've been around in Australia or not. I'm just second generation, so I wonder. I sometimes wonder if it was ever around maybe a while ago and it's died down because of the fact that the aging population is now needing more care rather than, you know what I mean?
But even in some traditional societies, and some people from Chinese background might correct me there, but the whole idea of Confucianism and wisdom, I think that's breaking down as the traditional multi-generational families are breaking down in mainstream China with the one-child policy. We've got you know, one child, two parents, and four grandparents. There's a lot of wisdom out there.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that I hope with Henry that we are going to the sort of society we envisage, and I'm encouraged that a younger person, if I may say so, has asked this question and identified this challenge for us, because it is something that all generations together have to cooperate about and discuss and change. I think just as we can look to some of the traditional societies whose members have migrated here and become Australians, or perhaps a better way of doing things. I think we can also look to our Indigenous culture. I very much like the use of the concept of elders and the language of elders in Indigenous culture, and I think that's a word. That's a word I think we can all feel pretty good about. It's good to be an elder, and it is coming in a little bit into our mainstream culture. I noticed I have a 12-year-old grandson. He was talking to me about some work he was doing, and he kept and it was about older people. He decided sort of to do a project on age discrimination. Truly, it was his own decision. And he kept saying, yes, well, you know, elders might need, you know, assistance on the bus, or elders, and he was just unconsciously describing my kids as elders. I wonder what elders. And then after a while, in a different conversation, it turned out that his teacher is an Indigenous woman, and she's obviously started to use the language of elders and the concept of elders, and he's just absorbed it. So I took great heart from that. One example, but I hope one that we'll see multiplied throughout our society.
Can I just add that when Susan started off and acknowledged the owners of traditional land, and acknowledged elders past and present, I always loved that. That's nice. I think it's a clutch to see that later.
Here we go.
Have you also considered, with an ageing population, the effect it's having on the generation below it, so that you have 70 and 80-year-old children having to care for 90-year-olds,
yeah,
and not only on on them in respect of their health and their own social life, and what effect that's going to have on their aging.
Yeah, so the question is about, it's often called the sandwich generation, usually 60-year-olds, but it could be 70 as well, yeah. Or some of the women in the middle, because it's usually women who are doing all this. So they're caring for an aging parent, or maybe a couple of aging parents.
Three.
Or three, yeah, well. Yeah, and a spouse, and their children, sometimes grandchildren. And so they may not be in the paid workforce, but they're certainly working. Yeah, and so there's quite a lot of research looking at that. There's an increased stress on that, and something called secondary role strain. Role strain. People do the research on this. So it's well recognised. And how do you deal with it? Community services are meant to help with that. But as I pointed out, there are limitations in how much we can afford as well.
There's limitations too on how much the elderly will accept help.
Absolutely. That's very common. Yeah. And also that's often culturally determined too.
Yeah. Yes, I've heard people say that my mother has been assessed and she is entitled to some home-based care, you know, 2 or 3 times a week, but she doesn't want it. She wants me, the daughter, to do it. And look, I think that's a really difficult human problem, and I encourage the daughter, of course, to say, look, you have to explain to your mother, you're entitled to have some time off, it's better for both of you, and it's very pleasant to have someone coming to assist you. But there is this unwillingness to have other than family members providing the care. And that's something we have to change too. And those of us who haven't reached that stage must remember when we do, we should accept care from a program and not, you know, say our children have to do it all. But that is one of the intergenerational sensitive things that I think, you know, we all just have to try and work out better than the situation you've described. I'll go on questions. Yes, go ahead.
I come from the point of
Yes,
I'm talking from the point of the people from culture and the diverse community. And I'm just, well, I see the difference from the 60s in aged care and services. I'm really very upset and cautious about the assessment of those people. First, because it's not in their language. Very few psychologists are in the language of the people that we've got, and even if they are not paid for jobs like that.
When you question the statistics of how many they are in nursing homes or their needs for that, quite often you come with the answer, oh, the nursing communities are looking after their own. Well, some of the communities are, and I come to the point that you said before that the parents might not want to, and sometimes the stigma of letting your parents go to a nursing home, which is a bigger thing. Nevertheless, we can't judge all by the same token, because there are a lot of people that they are isolated, whether their children are not close by or unable to look after them for many reasons, and those people are falling in the gaps. I just wonder what is there that we can do.
It's a resource issue, isn't it? Yes. We've got the big groups, the Italians, the Greeks, the Chinese, Arabic speaking, but you've got smaller groups where it's really hard. Like I had to cancel a home visit yesterday because we didn't have a Greek input. So that was, it's a real issue in being able to provide that. We don't have enough bilingual health practitioners or aged care providers to do that, and so we rely on interpreters. Interpreters are another expense to the community. And so often we use families, and that's not ideal, as you're pointing out. Yeah. And certainly testing people for their cognition. We know that it's really essential to have a skilled interpreter there.
And the issue of resources is always, if we have some extra resources, we will put interpreters. It's not always extra resources unless that is part and parcel of the policy of the organization. There will never be extra resources. This is my really fear. And if we can't find interpreters in the Greek, I wonder what's happening to the younger communities and the small communities.
Maybe that interpreter cancelled for that day and everyone else was booked.
Thanks again for that very interesting talk. I represent Media Access Australia, who specifically are about inclusion for all types of media for everyone, equal access. So ageing and disability are two large key factors for us. I think one of the questions I have is there yesterday some representatives attended the Parabolness and said it was wonderful, but is there an overarching group or collective that is looking at this issue? Because on one hand we have Ageing Australia and contributions to the workforce and what can be done to increase those contributions, and then we've got a perceived drain on resources. But then we've also got, we're ill prepared on many fronts to actually cater for any reforms. So I liken sometimes accessibility, especially with websites and digital media. It's a bit like the year 2000. All of a sudden we're going to find ourselves with this very big problem and we won't know what to do about it. So how can we actually form a collective and a group that are actually across all the issues that's not going to end up nowhere?
There is something called NACA, the National Aged Care Alliance, which is the big group for a lot of aged care groups, and they certainly have influence in policy. And whenever any government committee is formed, then they get input into that to do with aging. There's a it's called Australian Computer Clubs for Seniors.
Yes, Dan Bosworth.
Dan Bosworth, yes. And that's we're the fastest growing segment of using computers in Australia. So it's certainly happening. And whereas people who are 80 and above, I think, are not very computer literate. The people in their 70s and certainly their 60s are pretty savvy. And I think within 10 or 20 years, it won't be such an issue unless, well, inevitably there'll be another new technology that comes along that will leave me behind and people at my age. So there is, yes, the answer to the question, there is a national body. How much power it has, I don't know. The issue I've raised before about voting and being consolidated in the voting bloc Of course, older people split in their votes just as much as the rest of the population. Yeah.
Yes,
Susan,
they
of course,
do.
would know more.
Look,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Minister, yeah.
it would be wonderful if there was one overarching group that attended to all these issues. But in fact, there are a number of different bodies. There's your own. There's National Seniors. There's CODA. There is NACA, which is a consortium, and many others. But I think everyone who's concerned should get involved in an organisation. I mean, tomorrow I'm speaking to Older Women's Network, which has grown larger, more effective lobbying, particularly for the needs of older women, health, dementia, jobs, everything. I think it's important to get involved with a group. You won't get the one group that's doing everything. I know when I was in Parliament for many years, we used to think, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was just one group of teachers I had to deal with, that I could do all my big instead of, these, those, but there isn't. And I think although forming alliances can be very powerful around certain issues, most people will just find an organisation that does advance a particular thing like you're doing with access to media and pursue that. And look, I would just say as a former politician, always make your views known to the members of Parliament, the ministers, the shadow ministers, and your local member, whoever he or she may be. I have to repeat this here because people forget. I still think for an MP or a senator, receiving a number of messages arguing for the same thing does have an impact. And in this day and age where we have quite closely fought elections and we have minority parties and all of those things, I would never underestimate the importance of any lobby group or interest group making their views known. And these days with email, it's not even so hard. You get all their email addresses from the parliamentary website and away you go, because they are the people who manage the resources and are in charge of the legislation. So don't let them off the hook. That's just a little voice from past experience.
Thank you for such a great time and talk. I see you both as great warriors on our behalf and the elders' behalf. This is just a funny comment related to what you said and a previous question. But right this week, it's just a great area for lobbying, is the ABC has announced that where they're going to make their cutbacks are programs that especially relate to older people. And so let's go do something about that.
Here. I can't directly lobby myself in my role, but I think we've made a very good point. And look, if I can sort of just say what I think about this, media organisations, advertisers, and indeed the ABC keep assuming that you only have to address younger audiences. Now, of course you have to address younger audiences. Of course you have to provide for them. And if you're a business, you have to aim your products at them. But why ignore these rapidly growing cohorts of over 60s, over 70s, over 80s? I mean, Henry's presentation, take that, slide and just send it off to the ABC. I should be advocating this, but I do. Because it seems to me the ABC, for example, has a very loyal audience of older people who support it, who call friends of the ABC, do all these things. Now, they're as legitimate, they're as authentic a part of the audience as people in their 20s, but there are more of us. So to sort of suddenly say, we're going to disregard the kind of programs that mature people like and try and find all these things that mark or life on appeal to young people, it seems to me to be self-defeating as well. So there's another group to be formed. Lobbying might transpire as a result of today's meeting to the ABC. Don't forget to let Malcolm turn all Well, yes. Do we have anyone else who didn't get a question? You certainly can, but we'll just, yes. And then that will be the last one.
My name is Kwame, and just an observation. I attended this is the second forum that I've been on the Asian issue, and I've been made aware of some of the contributions that have been made by the older people.
without attending these two forums. I wasn't aware of the contributions that were being made by the older people. So I think one of the things that will probably help the course is the information and education, that people become more aware of the data that's out there in terms of what is represented today, to make people aware, so that the scale might start to shift a bit, that people don't think or see or view the older persons as a drain or a baby. The other suggestion might be what my colleague here said earlier in terms of the solution, might be an older person's Olympics. It's like they've got the Youth Olympics coming up. Might try to be aware of, drawing attention to the cause of the Olympics.
Thank you. And we promise you your second question. Are you waiting for that?
Yes, because I've got such a soft voice. I just have a question about a couple of the statistics and data that you Professor Brodaty presented at the beginning. It was a graph in which you had people on the age pension, people on the age pension gradually declining and going on to part pension. Part pension was coming up, full pension was declining. And you then subsequently talked
And the people on no pension was there.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what the change is about to go from full to part. And I wondered whether that connects with the statistic that you gave a little later about, I think it was 0.3 or 3% of older people more engaged in the workforce would have such a significant impact on the overall country and how they fit together.
So the question is about why there's a switch from part-time to full-time ratio. And I guess it's because of more assets, which might make them not eligible for the full pension. I'm guessing that maybe Susan has more information.
Look, I think that's right. I mean, even though superannuation isn't providing complete financial independence in retirement for everyone, which was kind of the idealistic hope, it certainly means that people are retiring now with some superannuation savings, whereas previously they had none. They are also, in some cases, I'm pleased to say, able to continue some part-time work, so they've got some income. They've acquired their houses because they got into the housing market at the time when it was realistic for ordinary people to buy a house, it's harder now. So I think it's just that people have got more assets, and so even though there's quite a generous assets and income test for eligibility for the part pension, more people, they'll qualify for part pension, but they won't qualify for full. So I think it's actually quite a positive reflection of the improvement in the financial circumstances of older Australians. So look, with that, we could go on all afternoon, but I know we've taken a lot of your time. Kenny, that's been such an informative and engaging address. I think everyone here, including Kwame, who said he didn't really know about all these things until he came, and you'll now be on a mission to share all this information with your own age group, Kwame. That's great. I think it's been very valuable that you've been able to share your great knowledge and experience with our audience today. So thank you so much, Henry, and congratulations on the work you do, and I know will continue to do for a very long time. So please thank Professor Booth.
Thank you very much. Also, I noticed there's some brochures for our Centre for Healthy Brain Aging on the table there if you want to look at.